Hello, this video will lay out some of my thoughts on migration. This will be a less historical video and will instead be a more informal and less structured argument for why I think European states, especially wealthy ones, such as the UK and France, have a moral obligation to accept migrants, whether or not they are beneficial economically or socially. Before delving into the main arguments, I would like to bring attention to how extreme and vitriolic the rhetoric and policy proposals are in Europe at the moment. This rhetoric is not coming from the fringe, but from mainstream, popular, and elected politicians. Anti-migrant hate and Islamophobia are now commonplace in day-to-day politics. Islamophobia and anti-migrant hatred are often coupled together. The rise of Islam in France has become synonymous with the rise of immigration, and both are treated with a similar level of fear and hatred. Essentially, migration has become racialized. Muslim migrants, even though they are coming from countries thousands of kilometers apart, are lumped together and considered an invasive and threatening other. For example, European politicians have said phrases like
ideology. So I rather would have no Quran at all, as we, in Holland at least, have outlawed Mein Kampf as well.
Parce que vous avez des groupes, que j'appelle ces extrémistes violents qui agissent au nom de l'islam et en détournant la religion, qui enseignent, expliquent dans le cadre d'associations, en utilisant toutes les libertés et les droits que la République offre, que notre pays offre. Ils enseignent qu'il ne faut pas respecter la France, qu'il ne faut pas respecter notre droit, qu'il faut en quelque sorte sortir de nos lois. Ils enseignent que les femmes ne sont pas l'égale des hommes. Ils enseignent que les petites filles ne doivent pas avoir les mêmes droits que les petits garçons. Pas chez nous.
Au premier rang de ces politiques imbéciles, il y a la question de l'immigration massive, qui est ancienne, qui est le terreau du communautarisme et la réponse aux questions que vous vous posez. Mais pourquoi y a-t-il des terroristes qui sont nés sur nos territoires de l'Europe? Eh bien pour ça. Parce que l'immigration massive a entraîné du communautarisme et que le communautarisme est le terreau dans lequel le fondamentalisme islamiste vient chercher et vient recruter ses futurs soldats.
This is not just rhetoric. States have concrete legislation targeting migrants. Here are some examples. In June of this year, new legislation regarding migration called the New Pact on Migration and Asylum came into effect in the European Union. It expands the ability for EU member states to enact harsh policies against asylum seekers. The legislation allows EU member states to detain asylum seekers for longer periods of time, for up to 6 months if the asylum request is rejected. It also expands the reasons for member states to deny asylum. To clarify, an asylum seeker is someone who is requesting asylum in the EU. If accepted, they are considered a refugee. While EU member states are supposed to follow international law, in reality they often act arbitrarily and deny asylum for illegitimate reasons. This new legislation exacerbates the problems in the asylum process. Silvia Carta, an advocacy officer at the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, said, "This regulation is going to create a draconian detention and deportation machine." In the latest round of negotiations, EU lawmakers doubled down on repression and punishment and agreed on a text that will expose hundreds of thousands of people to harm and violence. From locking people up in immigration detention for up to 30 months to tearing families apart and sending people to countries they don't even know, across the Atlantic, we see the violence and fear created by ICE's brutal immigration enforcement. Europe should be learning from the harms of that model, not building its own version of it. Essentially, this legislation makes it easier for European countries to deny, deport, and detain asylum seekers. It's disgusting. Another example is France's incredibly dysfunctional and exploitative residency permit laws, which makes migrant workers, especially black and brown ones, vulnerable to wage theft and employer abuse. Essentially, employers are given immense power by tying the right for migrant workers to stay in the country, to whether they can stay employed. Amnesty International claims that the policies regarding residency permits are systemic and contribute to a system in which migrants are vulnerable to the whims of their employer. Amnesty writes that many thousands of migrant workers are living permanently under the threat of having their residence permits refused or not renewed. Many have pointed out that these exploitative policies are a continuation of colonial policy. Historically, France imported hundreds of thousands of workers from its colonial empire for labor in the metropole. Today, France's economy is still in need of migrant labor, but the modern-day version of colonial labor has shifted to a system where workers are continuously at risk of being deported. Émilie Etienne and Adriana Garcia write that the irony of these restrictive policies is that the French economy actually shows an increasing need for a foreign labor force. The aging baby boomer generation and the low French fertility rates, despite the fact that France's fertility rates are the highest in the EU, are factors which have begun creating a labor shortage in certain employment sectors. Historically, France's response to labor shortages has been to import labor. Today, France's response is similar, but much more limited and hostile. Policies surrounding migrant labor are incredibly exploitative and dangerous for migrant workers. Overall, Europe makes life extremely difficult for migrants from the global south. This is not even considering the EU's externalization policies, which enable the EU to offload migration control to third-party countries. To clarify, I will be using the words migrants and migration to encompass people fleeing war and poverty. In reality, there is a fine line between refugees and migrants. It is often up to the discretion of states, and they do not always follow international law, obviously. In this video, I will use the term migration to describe the many countless desperate people moving to Europe from global south countries. I hope that the rhetoric and language surrounding migration, as well as the exploitative and abusive policies enacted in the EU, are sufficient to convince you that the way Europe treats migrants is deeply flawed. Next, I would like to discuss a couple points surrounding the language and rhetoric surrounding migration. The way the average European thinks and talks about migration plays into whitewashing and white supremacy. Let's begin with the first and honestly most important point. To begin with, European colonialism and imperialism need to be at the center of the conversation on migration in Europe. Most migrants and refugees come from countries that were directly or indirectly exploited and colonized by a European country. The colonization and exploitation of African countries by Europeans started in the 15th century and gradually expanded, resulting in outright conquest and subjugation. Mass slaughter and slavery were central to European colonial domination. In Congo, Belgians enacted brutal policies aimed at the maximum and rapid exploitation of natural resources, such as rubber and minerals like copper and cobalt. Belgian policy essentially used the Congo region ruthlessly to gather wealth for Belgium. For example, the drive to extract rubber from Congo started in 1891 and resulted in the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. Georges Nzongola Natalaja writes that the total subjugation of the inhabitants to the state and the concession companies made the Congo Free State an independent state of a peculiar type. Here was a state where the inhabitants were not citizens with democratic rights, but enslaved subjects of a sovereign they never saw. The only freedom that existed in this realm was for the Belgian king, his business partners, and his agents to plunder the country as they saw fit. The spoils of plunder constituted huge capital flows into Belgium. In fact, the extreme exploitation of Congolese resources by Belgium enabled their economic recovery after the two world wars. Colonization resulted in huge, widespread benefits for Belgians and death, plunder, and societal destruction for the Congolese. European colonialism destroyed Africa. It was theft on a grand scale. Is it not morally righteous for Europe to accept migrants from previously colonized countries? Before you say, oh, what about the Arab slave trade or Islamic conquests? This is a topic for another video, but there is a massive difference between pre-industrial conquest, such as is seen with the expansion of Islam, with modern colonialism. Colonialism is a process in which a colony is completely converted for the exploitation and domination of a mother country. Purposeful underdevelopment is also a part of the colonial process. Islamic conquest, on the other hand, is more analogous with the conquest going on in medieval Europe at the same time. Colonial empires conquer to extract resources and gain markets, while pre-modern empires, such as the Islamic ones, conquered for tax bases and to integrate territory within their wider empires. Unlike pre-modern conquest, European colonization in Africa resulted in the dramatic restructuring of the entire economy geared towards the maximum exploitation of the people and resources. In Algeria, France's conquest dismantled all pre-colonial societal and economic relations. In conjunction with a brutal conquest in which entire towns were eradicated, the French army and state immediately began large-scale land seizures. Land belonging to the indigenous Algerians was stolen and appropriated by the state and given to European settlers, the colons. This was called cantonnement. The seized land was often the most fertile land, eventually relegating the entire Algerian population to infertile, barren land, which created mass poverty and famine. Mahmoud Benoun writes that the outright seizure of buildings and businesses, along with land expropriation in the countryside, undermined the foundation of the Algerian pre-colonial mode of production. The economic life of numerous petty commodity producers, peasants, craftsmen, and artisans was shattered. Here is a quote from a resident of Algiers who witnessed the conquest and the destruction of his people's culture, and the departure of its people into the open desert, seeking aid for themselves against the enemy, until they came to beg among the tents of the Arabs. And they tasted suffering, and hunger, and fear, and the signs of their city were obliterated, and its symbols struck out. Its notables perished, its scholars dwindled away, its poets fell silent, its writers and public speakers were struck dumb. Here is an extract of a poem about the conquest of Algiers. The end of time has come. Henceforth, no more rest. The day of battle has shone. Grief to the living, happiness to the dead. I am grieved, O world, about Algiers. These miseries, it is God who brought them. After her days of glory, Algiers was dishonored. Tyranny and injustice were the cause of her fall. Wine was honored and debauchery tolerated. The God of creatures is everywhere, sees and never sleeps. The days, O brothers, see fortunes change. This destruction of the economic and cultural life of indigenous populations in Africa lay at the core of European colonialism. The exploitation of Africa by Europe is a direct cause for the poverty and violence seen in Africa today. And before you say, oh, but we decolonized 60 years ago and gave Africa independence. While Europeans gave African countries independence nominally in the 1950s and 1960s, exploitative relations were maintained by Europe. This is what is called neocolonialism. To take Congo as an example again, after gaining independence in 1960, the United States and Belgium allied with moderate Congolese leaders. They managed to oust nationalist Congolese leaders who wanted economic independence from the West. This is what led to Patrice Lumumba's death. The West ended up backing Mobutu, who protected Western mining interests in the Congo in exchange for support. If you are interested, watch my 2 videos on the Congo crisis. Overall, imperialism and colonialism still impact African countries. Western involvement in Africa is harmful and continuous to this day. The impact of imperialism and colonization needs to be at the center of the discussion about migration. For many European countries, letting in a small, manageable amount of refugees serves as a method to whitewash their image to the whole world. European liberal politicians allow a token amount of refugees into the country, which distracts from the EU's deadly policies which target migrants before they even reach European soil. Many refugees don't even make it to Europe. Thousands die each year on the journey. 2026 is actually looking like one of the deadliest years for refugees coming from Africa across the Mediterranean, with around 600 drowning in January and February alone. Furthermore, millions of migrants are stuck in third-party countries like Tunisia, Libya, Mauritania, and Turkey, and are unable to travel further on towards Europe. These countries work directly with the EU to ensure these migrants are not able to travel towards Europe. In exchange, the EU provides these countries with funding. Much has been written about the development of a humanitarian border. Along with the increased policing, militarization, and bureaucratization of borders, many scholars discuss the creation of a humanitarian facade to borders. William Walters claims that the so-called humanitarian border emerged when the journey to the global north had, for many people around the world, become a necessity for their lives. In parallel to the increasing militarization of EU borders, EU states have also used humanitarianism, both in language and action, to whitewash their image. Essentially, humanitarian organizations, often receiving funding and support from the EU, are used in conjunction with abusive deportation and border control policies as a method of sanitizing violent border control. Walters explains how, for European officials, the words detention and deportation are replaced with reception and repatriation. This language is used while the European border is increasingly becoming repressive. Walters explains that Europe has a situation where military tactics, advanced surveillance technology, naval patrols, armed guards and guard dogs, watchtowers, razor wire, and much else are deemed politically necessary and legitimate elements in the defense of the borders of the global north faced with an invasion of migrants and asylum seekers. Walters argues that the extreme, violent nature of these policies ensured a need for European officials to incorporate humanitarian language and action in order to maintain the repressive status quo. Humanitarian organizations are part of a system that whitewashes the abuse of migrants. How is this system acceptable? Europe has spent centuries destroying African countries and now is abusing, detaining, and deporting desperate people from these countries seeking basic life necessities, all while using the humanitarian industry to whitewash and maintain a fundamentally rotten system. The easiest and least hypocritical way of ending the migration crisis is by stopping the exploitative policies that wrecked African countries in the first place, and also by sending reparations for the harm of colonialism historically. Mass migration does not mean Europe is amazing. There is nothing inherently amazing about Europe, and migration to Europe is motivated by its economic benefits, which, for the 20th time, exist because of colonialism. People often frame migration as people fleeing from bad countries towards good countries in Europe, but this ignores two things. First, those bad countries are often struggling due to centuries of Western exploitation and involvement. And secondly, Europe is only good due to its accumulated wealth. Many refugees and migrants leave their true homes, families, and communities for a foreign land purely out of desperation. Furthermore, it is extremely gross how politicians frame migration as beneficial simply because migrants perform some of the least prestigious jobs in society. Here are some examples.
This country needs immigrants to survive. Immigrants pick the food we eat, rebuild our communities after climate disasters, help construct our infrastructure, power our small business economy, clean our homes, and
take the care sector, difficult sector for everybody, but without immigrants, without immigration, well, in these aging societies Europe is in now, without immigration, we cannot really cover the services in the care sector.
He hires them through one of the many agencies who recruit workers from poorer countries in the European Union willing to work hard for a minimum wage.
We have to take care of them.
Migrants are no different than citizens and should not be treated as servants to Europeans. Many are highly educated professionals whose expertise is routinely ignored by Europe. Ultimately, migrants coming to Europe do not need to be grateful in the slightest for the benefits provided by European wealth. Through centuries of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, Europe accumulated massive riches, and Europeans should never expect their victims to be grateful to benefit from wealth that was stolen from them in the first place. It's important that European states acknowledge and pay for their role in worsening and often destroying the economic conditions of African countries. This moral obligation needs to be at the center of any conversation of mass migration to Europe. Thanks for watching.